What if Larry Williams made a Prince-produced 80s comeback? That's the scenario we'll be considering on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the track I picked this week was Dizzy Miss Lizzy by Larry Williams, and I attempted to turn that into a 1980s Minneapolis funk style song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, if you're not familiar with Larry Williams, you're not alone, and I think that's a great shame. So I'm kind of hoping that by talking about him today, I can do a tiny bit to just remind people of how great he was. Because for me, he's certainly one of the great unsung legends of rock and roll. And like probably quite a lot of people, I initially became aware of him kind of secondhand through listening to the Beatles. And the Beatles were big Larry Williams fans. As well as Dizzy Miss Lizzy, they also covered Bad Boy and Slow Down. And I listened to these records, saw this name cropping up in the credits and wondered who this Larry Williams guy was. And then I think a little while afterwards, maybe my third or fourth tape that I ever owned was some kind of jukebox classics compilation, and that included Boney Maroney by Larry Williams. Fantastic record, just such an amazing charismatic presence on record. From there I went on to learn a bit more about him and his story, which is both pretty fascinating but also kind of tragic. If you don't know, he came up very much as a contemporary of Little Richard. They were friends. They signed to the same record label, Specialty Records. When Little Richard's career went on hiatus as he had his first of several religious awakenings and went back to the church, that was the point where the label started to push Larry Williams into that place. They had a similar sound, similar style, this kind of fairly wild, screaming vocals, this sort of driving piano-led rock and roll style. So 1957, you get this great little run of hits from Larry Williams, and for a little while there he's absolutely on fire, but unfortunately he can't sustain that momentum, partly due to running into trouble with the law. He gets arrested on some drug charges, some gun charges. So basically any career momentum he has is totally flushed by this, and by the time he's ready to return to the public eye, that initial wave of rock and roll is gone. But if you follow his career along, he's really proves himself to be remarkably adaptable. So you find him cropping up in the mid-60s in the UK. Actually had a bit of a touring double act with the great blues guitarist Johnny Guitar Watson, and they made some records in the UK backed by a group called the Stormsville Shakers, who are just a UK beat group. And it's really interesting to hear this because on these records you can hear Larry Williams metamorphosing to move with the times. So he's still got his original rock and roll sound, he can still turn back to that, but you can already hear him moving into soul music. There's a real kind of soul feel to some of the stuff. At the same time, he's also trying his hand at the UK beat group sound. So there's a great LP called The Larry Williams Show, which along with updated versions of Slow Down and things, also has him covering For Your Love by the Yardbirds, which he does a great version of. So he's just clearly listening to what's going on, just making sure that he can adapt to all the sounds of the day, and he does it really well. Sadly, none of these records particularly took off, but he just kept plugging away. I think he actually produced some Little Richard records around the time because Little Richard was making a bit of a comeback, so there's a few great kind of soul-flavoured Little Richard records on the OK label around that time in the 60s as well, and that was Larry Williams' influence on the production side there. So he's doing great work, but still success continues to elude him. And unfortunately, he's still involved in drugs. He's still living a pretty dark and edgy lifestyle, which encroaches on his work as well. So into the 70s, you see his friend and partner, Johnny Guitar Watson, actually manages a successful musical rebirth as a funk performer. And Larry Williams tries his hand at that as well. His final album, That Larry Williams, sees him attempting a bit of a P-funk thing. And again, he's a really talented guy, so it sounds pretty good. I was dreading listening to this when I discovered it existed, but honestly, it's really a pretty solid album. Save for, there's a remake of Boney Maroney as Boney Maroney Disco Queen, which I'm not so sure about. Maybe could have left that one off. But otherwise, it's a different sound. He's just adapted to it again. Does it pretty credibly, but once again, didn't find its mark commercially. I think that was around 1978. And then tragically, in 1980, Larry Williams is found dead of a gunshot wound, which is ruled a suicide. There is speculation that, given some of the seedier aspects of life that he was involved in, that maybe actually it was a murder that's been covered up. I don't know about that. I'm not going to speculate, but either way, it was just a great tragedy. I mean, the guy was 44 years old, still had all the talent in the world, still had so much potential, and he's just somehow never quite made it to the point of being reassessed or rediscovered. His name never quite makes it into that top tier of rock and roll legends for a lot of people. And there are probably people who are less deserving than him who do make it into that list. So if you are at all interested in classic rock and roll, definitely check out those early hits. I think his first album has pretty much all of that stuff on, or there are great compilations kicking around. But I'd also definitely urge you to check out that mid-60s output as well, because it's really cool. Definitely worth a look. Yeah, I think it was thinking about those attempts in the 70s to reinvent himself as a funk performer that had me thinking about what might have been the next thing for Larry Williams had he survived further into the 1980s. And to me, the obvious step for him would have been to try and move towards the Minneapolis sound. Surely one of the definitive sounds of the 80s, certainly in black music, but just in terms of 80s pop altogether. I think it was just the way that it gathered a number of seemingly disparate musical threads and brought them together into something that felt very new and modern and forward-looking, but at the same time had very clear links to a rich R&B and funk tradition as well. So clearly building on a foundation of James Brown and P-funk and classic rock and roll, but then taking in the sounds of contemporary new wave and synth pop and fusing it all together into something that sounded pretty futuristic for the early 80s. And obviously, to a large extent, we can say this is down to Prince. I mean, he was the visionary, undisputed genius of that early 80s Minneapolis scene and had a hand in the careers of so many of the other performers who came out of that scene. But we definitely can't discount the contributions of loads of the other greats who came out of that. Obviously, Morris Day, who led the time, a bunch of the people who came out of the time as well, or who served in that band at various points. Jesse Johnson, Jelly Bean Johnson, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and many others all were steeped in this sound, brought their own contributions to it. They helped to make it just the defining sound of that time in the 80s. And Minneapolis at the turn of the 80s was a pretty unique and fascinating city. And certainly for a good few years in the early 80s there, you could argue that it was simultaneously home to two of the most important scenes in all of the popular music of the era. And in fact, both of those scenes pretty much had their home base in the same building, because I guess the famous venue First Avenue, which was featured in the Purple Rain movie, functioned as a central hub for that whole Minneapolis sound that grew up around Prince. But then its sort of smaller room, 7th Street entry, served as a hub for the Minneapolis punk scene that existed in parallel, which gave the world bands like Husker Du and The Replacements and Soul Asylum, these bands who would be hugely influential in the next decade as well. So there was a hell of a lot going on there. I'd say probably having the funk and R&B scene and the sort of punk and new wave scene coexisting in these same spaces, that's probably part of what led to that Minneapolis funk sound being so unique, because there's just so much cross-pollination between different sounds going on in there. Taking traditional elements of funk and R&B arrangements, but then utilising technology to make them new and fresh, and just mixing and matching instrumental styles like guitar styles as well. So sometimes you'll be hearing scratchy James Brown clean rhythm guitars, but on the same track you might have some kind of wild off-the-wall Hendrixy hard rock lead guitar as well. So just mixing those rock elements in there with the funk classicism and the ultra-modern new wave and synth pop sounds, so you end up with something that sounds like this otherworldly hybrid of James Brown and Devo or something. But yeah, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So essentially I just speculated this week that in an alternative timeline, Larry Williams, instead of passing away tragically in 1980, in this other timeline, he's taken a bit of a knock from his P-Funk style album, not doing too well, but has gone away, got himself cleaned up, and emerged sober and focused and ready to do whatever it takes to get his career back on track. And while he's been preparing to make this comeback, the one album he's been listening to more than anything else has been Dirty Mind by Prince, and he's convinced that this is the sound of the future. So he knows that what he needs to do is head to Minneapolis and just find a way to work with this young maverick genius. So he does that, relocates to the Twin Cities, finds a way to get in touch with Prince, and as luck would have it, Prince is a massive fan, really familiar with all his old work, and is really honoured to be asked to work with him. So decides he's going to be the producer of the Larry Williams comeback record, assembles a crack backing band made up of members of the Revolution and the Time, and they put together a set of new songs and some old Larry Williams classics re-recorded in this new style. And the lead single from the album is this Minneapolis funk version of Dizzy Miss Lizzy, featuring Prince doing a bit of a guest lead guitar solo as well, and becomes a massive hit and relaunches Larry Williams, where he finally manages to get both the commercial success and the critical respect that he's deserved for so long. So yeah, in order to try and create this comeback single for Mr. Williams, the first thing I always do with these things is just take the isolated vocal, drop it into GarageBand and sync it up to the grid so everything's nice and in time. Having done that, the next step was to pop on some drums. So program that in with my MIDI keyboard. I've got an acoustic kit on there, heavily processed so it sounds almost completely artificial. Got a really big gated reverb on the snare for that kind of huge, kind of crashing 80s sound. I mixed that in with some elements of drum machine as well. I think there's a drum machine cowbell and possibly a couple of other things happening in there too. Bass-wise, you hear a lot of synth bass on some of those Minneapolis things, but there are also some great electric bass players in that scene too, so I couldn't decide which to go for, so I went for both. So in one speaker you've got a synth bass, in the other speaker you've got me on the bass guitar, basically playing the same thing with a little very primitive slapping and popping, because I'm not very good at that stuff. I went for some guitars next. So there are 3 guitars in all on there. The main one that runs all the way through is just doing that high strummed classic funk rhythm, playing what I always think of them as James Brown chords. I guess they're kind of jazz chords. Got very heavy compression on there, which just gives it that really tight, very 80s sound. All these guitars, by the way, I played on my homemade Telecaster, which is the closest thing I had to a Hohner Wildcat, which is the kind of classic Prince Tele copy that he played. The second guitar, which comes in a bit into the track, again heavily compressed, and that's just playing a repeated single note riff with palm muting, just another kind of funky little touch that just repeats away underneath everything. And then right towards the end of the track, just threw in some lead guitar because I wanted to have a bit of a slightly Prince-like lead just playing out over the end. Obviously I can't play like Prince, that would be ridiculous, but I just played something bluesy, went for a sound that was as close as I could manage to a Prince sound. So using GarageBand's pedals, there's one that's basically a Boss DS1, which was the Prince distortion pedal, so I've got that on kind of fairly cranked up. There's a flanger on there and an octave down pedal as well, so you get that kind of sweeping kind of jet engine taking off sound from the flanger, and also that kind of thickness from the octave pedal, which you hear in a lot of Prince's leads. And then added a few synths. So there are synths doing a few different things on there. There's one high pad that goes for most of the track, and that's just adding a bit of a general ambience to the track. It's not doing much, it's not too in your face either, but it's just there kind of filling in some sonic space. Then I've got some synth brass playing what would be horn riffs, but it's not the most authentic sound. There's a particular sound that you hear on a lot of those records which I just couldn't get on GarageBand, but it does the job. And there's also a couple of bits of synth strings in there as well, just playing another riff, just adding another little line that weaves in and out there too. And then for the video, what I'd normally do is start off with some footage of the performer singing the song. Unfortunately, as far as I can gather, certainly on YouTube at least, there's no footage whatsoever of Larry Williams performing any song, let alone this one, which made things a little bit tricky. So the main performance that's in there is actually, I found a really cool performance from Soul Train with Jesse Johnson's band, the Jesse Johnson Review, who've just got that classic Minneapolis look, just the clothes and the hair and everything, and the stage moves. They've got all these great choreographed, coordinated stage moves. So they had the look that I wanted for a backing band for him. So there's quite a lot of that performance there. Got some more Soul Train dancers just dancing along to it as well, giving us that early 80s R&B vibe. And then I've got some mocked up photos. I thought I'd just pop Larry Williams in some Minneapolis context. So we've got him hanging around outside First Avenue and meeting Prince and hanging out with The Time. And I also mocked up some posters, as I like to do as well. So we've got him there in the First Avenue listings and also supporting Prince. So hopefully that fills in the void where obviously there should be a performance if there was any footage. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a bit of a labour of love for me because, as hopefully you can tell, I love Larry Williams records and I feel like he deserves more recognition. I also really like that Minneapolis sound and it was great fun trying to recreate that. So if you did enjoy it, please let me know down in the comments. Also, if you can like and subscribe, that's great, really helps the channel. If you want to share it with your friends, that's great too. And if there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, or any songs you'd like me to investigate, let me know as well. I always really appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.